Good evening and welcome to Hardfire. I'm your host, Joseph Dobrian, and welcome to another half hour of news and current events from a libertarian perspective. Tonight we are going to be discussing the subject of taxation, specifically the role of taxation in political economy. And with me tonight to discuss it from Yorkton, Saskatchewan is economist Gary Marshall, and here in the studio with me is economist and diplomat Cameron Weber, and they are going to present two somewhat differing views of whether or not we need taxation in order to run a government, run a society. I believe it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who said that taxation is the price that we pay for civilization. But Gary, you take a somewhat opposite viewpoint, don't you? I understand that you think we can get along without taxes.
Yes, there's when you analyze the costs and benefits of taxation, you can forego the taxation, and government in turn to fund its expenditures can start a program of borrowing, perpetual borrowing.
That sounds incredible, but I want to hear how it's done.
Well, it's a little complicated, but there is a big problem in current economics, in that an assumption was made a long time ago that taxation is the best means of raising capital for government expenditures. It is not, and there are good reasons as to why. To test the assumption, all one has to do is add up the costs, the financial costs and benefits of taxation. If the costs exceed benefits, then you get rid of taxation. Otherwise, you retain it. Now, we all know that taxation has enormous costs, but what are the benefits of taxation? What's the payoff that surpasses all costs? Well, before I get into that, I just want to make an important point. Government funds its expenditures by handing the bill always to someone else. If a government has, say, annual expenditures of $1 billion, then it takes the money from the taxpayer for those expenditures, and that is all the tax-paying citizens and corporations of the nation. If the government incurs liabilities, well, then it's the same taxpayer that's on the hook for those liabilities. So to obtain a proper cost-benefit analysis of taxation, one must look at how taxation affects the financial assets and liabilities of the entire nation. That is, all those citizens and corporations, and not look at how it affects the government.
Well, we all complain about it, I know that.
Well, there are huge costs in government taxing. So if we look at it from two ways, now suppose the government needs, say, $1,000 for some expenditure. It can tax or borrow the funds. If it taxes, then the citizens and corporations of the nation are out $1,000. Now, if it borrows the funds, and under two conditions, from U.S. residents and in U.S. currency only, then the nation's debt will rise by $1,000. But so will the nation's assets, because those people, the bondholders that lent the $1,000, will now have an IOU from the government for that amount. And if the government were to borrow $100 to pay to its U.S. resident bondholders, then the nation's debt will rise by a further $100. But then so will the nation's financial assets, because the new lenders of the $100 will receive a note for exactly the same amount. So if the government were to start borrowing every penny it spends from U.S. residents and in U.S. currency only, then the wealth of the nation would be unaltered in the transaction. A rise in the nation's debts would always be perfectly balanced with a rise in the nation's assets. Therefore, taxation has no benefit, financial or otherwise. In fact, it's all cost and no benefit.
Okay, but if the citizen were to support the government through lending, as you apparently suggest, would that be compulsory or would it be voluntary?
It's all voluntary. It's done on a market basis. So the government would have to go out into the financial markets and borrow on that particular day at whatever the market rate is offering.
Okay. What puzzles me, though, is that this sounds a little bit like a scene from a play I once saw called Life with Father, where the lady of the house buys some extravagant item, and then her husband objects to it, and she says, well, then if you don't like it, take it back and we'll exchange it for something else. And he says, but I'm still out $100. And she says, well, but if you take that item back, they're certainly not going to charge you $100 for it if you exchange it for something else. You see, it's a little hard to follow for me. But maybe you can, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you at such length, but go on with your presentation and then we'll ask questions later.
Okay, well, the people will argue that the IOU handed out by the government, the bond, is essentially worthless, that it has no value. Now, what backs that IOU are the assets of the nation, that is, of all the citizens and corporations. And what would happen to those assets were government to abolish taxation and begin borrowing all of its expenditures? Well, two important obligations will now come into play. One, the government will now have a capital charge. If the borrowing rate is 7%, then the government will have to earn at least that on some public venture. And number two, that the government will have to face the nation every time it requires funds. So they'll have to go out into the marketplace and they'll learn very quickly not to maltreat the banker for fear funds will be cut off. Now, these two obligations will create a revolution in how government operates. The cost of government would certainly contract. There will be wasteful expenditures will certainly decline rapidly as the government must meet the borrowing rate on any public venture. There will be no more subsidies to favored individuals or persons. There will be no more tax collection. There'll be far less corruption, and there will be far fewer and much smaller government departments. There will be far greater controls on enduring expenditures, and there will be the use of service fees to curb the abuses of public resources. In a government with annual expenditures of, say, $300 billion, $100 billion in savings could easily be obtained. And what would happen to the other side, to all the assets of all the citizens and corporations? Well, taxation is a deterrent. It deters one from doing what he would normally do where there's no taxation. So if you abolish taxation, there will be a lot more economic activity. There'll be no taxes to pay. There'll be no papers to file. There'll be no taxes in the prices of goods. There will be no tax distortions in the financial, labor, and commercial markets. There will be far less needless interference in regulation by government. There will be more open and competitive markets and no tax inequities. In my home country of Canada, with savings from government's annual expenditures combined with the increase in the value of the assets of all the citizens and corporations, I conservatively estimate over a 4-year period an increase in the wealth of the nation of approximately $1 trillion with the abolition of taxation. In the United States, you can multiply that figure by 10, meaning a $10 trillion increase. Now, of course, the financial liabilities of the nation will rise and at unprecedented levels. And that is certainly true. But then so will the assets of the nation. Those savings in government expenditures and those increases in the value of those increases in the assets of the nation through increased economic activity, and they'll rise. Those assets will rise at double the rate of the increase in the debts.
Okay, well, here's what puzzles me. How easy would it be to actually implement such a system? Well,
it wouldn't be very hard at all. I mean, On the financial markets, a few people can borrow billions of dollars in the bond markets, and you have an enormous system right now that collects taxes. There are tax courts and judges and enforcement bureaus and all sorts of rules and regulations and people interpreting that. You can get rid of all that and replace that with a handful of people that will go out there into the financial markets and borrow, you know, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of days, weeks, months, and years.
Okay. Well, that sounds real interesting, but I think at this point we're going to get back to some of the rest of your ideas later. But for just a moment, let me just bring Cameron Weber into this discussion. And Cameron, I'd like to ask you, is it feasible to run a government, run a state or a society with no taxation, in your opinion?
Yes. Unfortunately, I'm in the position here on a libertarian TV show arguing for taxes, so that's kind of strange. But Gary Marshall in Canada, it's a very good idea. Now, the only way that would work is if the government was very, very small, okay? So I'd like to just make maybe about 3 or 4 points in response. First off, yes, I agree with you that if we got rid of taxes, there would be no tax distortions, economic productivity would be great, the wealth of the nation would improve. It really would be a very good economic situation to get rid of taxes. Also, yes, to get rid of taxes, you would no longer have a manipulation of the tax code with special interest tax breaks. And again, an excellent idea. Now, but what bothers me about this utopian scheme is number one, you say that the government borrowing would be backed by the assets of the nation. I would not want my personal assets to be pledged for the borrowing of any government, number one. Number two, what you're proposing would only work in a closed system where the country did not trade with anybody else. When you have a currency which is not backed by the ability of the government to tax in order to pay for its debt, the currency of that government will decrease in value over time, and the purchasing power of the citizens will go down. So the people in that country will be able to buy less and less over time in the world market. And that's the worst thing. It's the inflationary aspects of this idea. A lot of people have proposed it, not in such a radical form, but in terms of using inflation to grow the economy. Your idea to abolish taxes is neat, but it has the same problem of inflating growth, which is the negative purchasing power and inflation that would cause. The third or fourth point I'd like to make is how do you propose the government pay back the debt? What would their income be? You propose user fees. However, anything that generates income should be privatized. The only thing the government should be doing are public goods things which can't be traded in the market, so there's really no way to generate income. That would be fire protection, military defense, emergency medical services, things like that, which don't generate any cash streams against which to pledge bond receipts.
Okay, Gary, what do you have to say to that?
Okay, well, excellent points, each and every one. Cameron's concerned that the borrowing the perpetual borrowing, he's pledging his assets, and he doesn't want to do that to back the nation's debt. Well, currently, his assets do back the nation's debt. What I'm proposing doesn't change that. When the government borrows money, it's not the government who's paying taxes. They're not on the hook. It's the people, the individual taxpayers who are. They have to eventually settle all those obligations. So to say that I know he doesn't want that to happen, but that is in fact reality. He said that the currency wouldn't be backed by a government. Well, the currency at this time isn't really backed by a government, or as if I read that correctly. Cameron?
Well, the greenback is sort of fiat money, isn't it?
Yeah, that was my point. It used to be the gold standard, and then that was unsustainable. And so what's happened over time throughout history, since the governments first started confiscating people's assets and income through taxes, was the ability to tax is how they back up their borrowing, is because the only way that someone will lend money to someone is if they know there's an income stream to be generated to be able to pay it back.
Well, if one were to look at how a bank operates by borrowing huge amounts of money and lending out huge amounts of money. It is, and it makes its money on the margins. Now, the nation or the government would be borrowing huge amounts of money, and it would also be expending huge amounts of money. Now, the government works for the people, the nation. That's their task. They provide services. So the government wouldn't be much different from a large bank. And what will happen is the returns will go to the public. The huge returns that the massive government bank will generate will go to the public. So this is the increase in assets for the nation.
How can those returns be guaranteed, though?
Yeah, how does the government pay back the interest on the debt?
Oh, okay, well, it borrows the interest. Well, in fact, you'll find that most things are Ponzi schemes, but in this instance, the government, you're concentrating on the government. It's not the government that's paying back the debt, it's the nation that's paying back the debt. And how does a bank pay back its depositors? Well, it never does. I mean, depositors change, they come and go. But what the bank does is it always has new depositors. So each one will be paid off individually. But as a whole, the number of depositors it has grows and grows and grows, as do the amounts of those deposits. Now, when the government the returns from this operation go directly to the people. So the people benefit in having a large and growing economy. They benefit from that, and they also benefit from great control over the government's expenditures.
Okay, but let me interrupt you there, Gary, and let me ask you this question. As I understand it, the difference between what a bank does and a Ponzi scheme is this. The bank will borrow and then borrow further to pay off the original investors. That's true. But in the meantime, they are investing that money in actual productive enterprises. They will buy stock, they will buy real estate, they will buy other money-making operations. In a Ponzi scheme, no, that money just goes into Mr. Ponzi's pocket, and he then spends it on expensive cigars and champagne and dates with hookers.
And then leaves the country.
Which is basically what the government is going to do when it goes out and prosecutes illegal wars and fun stuff of that sort. Isn't that about right?
Well, that's correct. But the government is making investments. It's just that at this time we don't really know the value of those investments because the government takes money. It doesn't justify what it takes. The money just arrives, whether we like it or not. So the government, we don't know really how much it needs to provide the services that the nation requires. Now, if you introduce a capital charge to government, that they have to borrow at a 7% interest rate, well, then they have to justify their expenditures. The only way that they can justify that is by returning, by having a return that is greater than its borrowing cost. Now, there's a big problem in public economics. There is no way of measuring at this time, really, for most things, the value of what the services that government provides. Because they don't have a capital charge and they take the money, there's a lot of services that really aren't necessary. by introducing a capital charge, that will drive down the services, the services that are of little value. It will get rid of them, and it will keep the ones that are of value, that do meet that greater than 7% return. It's just that in public economics at this time is not so developed that it can do that, and that's where you will find a great many economists will have to spend their time. And that
but
is
Gary, what does the government do that returns anything, is what I'm saying. The court systems, the police, fire, education, how do you measure any cash flow returns against which to charge capital, a capital charge? How do you measure cost benefit for things that don't have any income?
Let's say you have somebody on welfare. That is costing the state so much money per year. Let's say it's costing the state $15,000 a year. Okay, now if you were to figure out what the value of an annuity is that pays $15,000 a year, it would be somewhere around, in this time, maybe around $250,000. That, if that person remains on welfare, that is the cost to the state, because that's what they'd have to put in a bank account to pay that person. Now, if you can turn around and offer this person a loan of, say, $50,000 to get themselves an education and to get themselves a good paying job so that they can pay back that loan, then you've saved the state at least $200,000.
Okay, but let me ask you this, Gary. If I'm a guy who is being asked to lend this money to the United States government to in turn lend to a current welfare recipient, supposing I take the cynical attitude and I say, oh, for crying out loud, we know he's just going to drink up that money, and I refuse to lend it to you. Now, I'll give you the good liberal question. I mean, if I were a good liberal Democrat or a socialist or whatever, I would say, wait a minute, evil rich fat cats are not going to lend money for that purpose. They're too greedy. You got to have taxation to take care of that poor guy on welfare who cannot help himself any other way. What would you say to that?
Well, if you do have somebody who's suffering in life, I mean, everybody's welcomes a helping hand. Well, most people welcome a helping hand. There will of course be those people that will not. I mean, there's going to have to be a little bit more consideration for those people that need far greater resources. Perhaps the resources that they need, which is alcoholic counseling and all sorts of things, might push the cost to $100,000. Okay, the nation is still better off. If the cost goes any higher, or if it goes above the 250,000 figure mentioned earlier, then the state might say, okay, we're better off just paying this man $15,000 a year and let him get through his problems on his own.
How about the inflation issue? Yes, these are political economy questions that need to be addressed, whether or not they're funded by debt alone or debt and taxation. I agree. Gary Marshall, you didn't address the inflation issue. I just want to read really quickly a quote from John Maynard Keynes. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they also confiscate arbitrarily. And while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Without what you've talked about is a recipe for government just to print money to pay its debt, debase the currency, and it's a Ponzi scheme. Believe me, I agree with you that there needs to be checks on government spending and rethinking the way programs are authorized and things like that, but inflating the currency just isn't the way to do it. Come back with another idea, and that would be great.
Gary, do you have any quick refutation of Cameron's assertion there?
Yes, well, governments can do that right now. They can print as
They
much
do
money.
that.
They do that. They can print as
No
much
kidding, they do.
They can print as much money as they like. The question is will they do it when they have to face the nation to borrow their funds?
They've always done it.
Will they be going out when they have no other reliance than borrowing, that is, facing the nation? Will they go out and borrow exorbitant amounts of money to give to their friends?
What will happen, Gary, when people just refuse to lend to them? Then what does the government do?
Well, there's always going to be somebody who's willing to lend. It just depends at what rate. If you have a reckless government who's borrowing all sorts of money and expending it on the most worthless of ventures, there's going to be few lenders out there. People will not lend to that. One, they won't like it as a citizen of that nation, and two, they won't like it as to see where things are going.
So eventually, would I have the right to break President Bush's legs if he doesn't pay up?
Well, it's not so much George Bush, it's your fellow citizens and corporations that won't pay up.
That's a lot of legs to break.
Well, if George Bush doesn't pay up, then you replace him and you get somebody who will. And you will have, the nation will have a far greater amount of wealth with which to do that. All businesses and all businessmen and all people have debts. And everybody, well, there are a few that don't, but many do. The question is it's not what's the value of their debt, it's what's the value of their assets. Do they have enough to cover those debts? And that's the same with government, with the nation. The nation will have debts, certainly, unprecedented amounts of debt.
Well, that just goes to show you, I think, that the Libertarian Party is hardly a monolith. We've got serious disagreements on a lot of issues, particularly on economic issues. So thank you very much, Gary Marshall, and thank you very much, Cameron Weber, both of you, for a very enlightening evening. I'm Joseph Dobrian. Tune in next time for Hardfire.
Hardfire is funded in part by the Libertarian Party of New York. www.ny.lp.org. Catering for the cast and crew of Hardfire is generously provided by Da Vincenzo Restaurant, 256 Prospect Park West, Brooklyn, New York, 11215. 718-369-3590. www.davincenzorestaurant.com.